Thank you very much. Also, dialing in remotely, given the kind of political craziness that we follow around with COVID and sitting in South Africa, we're in the naughty state at the moment. So doing this remotely, and thanks everybody for attending and watching in. I'm going to just share my screen. So ValueNature is a startup based in South Africa, comprised of a group of concerned conservationists that realize that the current approach to valuing nature is not advancing global climate targets at the rate that it needs to. We've identified the right mix of science-based biodiversity metrics, technology, and data systems to create proof of existence to ensure fully trustable, traceable, and transparent biodiversity credits on the blockchain. Each ValueNature biodiversity credit is unique and represents 1 hectare of land for a specific project site that is protected for 1 year. This enables a reliable revenue stream to be created for the landscape that can be invested into local green jobs and infrastructure, ultimately securing and increasing biodiversity gains regionally. The carbon credit market is wholly inadequate to meet the G7 and UN endorsed target to protect 30% of the planet by 2030. Unfortunately, many people have dissociated the fact that the carbon stocks in forests and wilderness regions are actually represented and maintained by biodiversity. Plants, above and below ground biomass, is the very carbon we are trying to secure, while healthy wildlife and insect communities maintain the diversity and promote plant and soil carbon sequestration and storage.
Wildlife concessions, making up 66% of conservation real estate in Southern and East Africa, are under massive threat, with most sitting economically dormant and unmanaged. We at ValueNature have identified a way to help land managers wildlife concessions, making up 66% over 10 million hectares of critical biodiversity and carbon stocks in these areas by 2030.
I'm a conservation ecologist, working to bridge the gap between conservation technology and
conserve global. I see a glaring lack of technology used in the voluntary carbon market, to the detriment of biodiversity and its community custodians, with accreditation taking up to 5 years, costing hundreds of thousands.
Sorry, I seem to have had a problem there with that video. It seems to be glitching. I'll just continue without it. It shouldn't be a problem.
Deb, sorry, we heard something twice or some. So didn't work quite well.
It seems to be doubling.
Yeah.
It seems to be doubling up. If you can hear me, then that's fine.
We can hear you. Perfect.
Okay, great. So conserving and protecting forests and wilderness regions represents at least 30% of the action needed to keep global average temperature rise at or below 20 degrees Celsius. However, the perverse incentives of additionality considerations and the lack of global support for standing stocks of semi-protected forests and conservation landscapes means that often communities and governments are not rewarded for their continued efforts to protect them. A good example to illustrate these perverse incentives in Africa is in Tanzania. It is one of Africa's fastest population growth rates, with an extra 17 million people being added by 2030, and yet has allocated nearly 40% of its total area to conservation, a great achievement for a developing country. The vast majority of this area has historically been protected either through photographic tourism or trophy hunting. With the impacts of COVID on international travel and the banning of trophy imports into many Western countries, there's a desperate need for alternative revenue streams for these areas to remain protected as their population expands into these regions. However, for the Tanzanian government to best optimize returns from the carbon industry, they should declare their forest reserves for logging or charcoal production, following which they could calculate massive additionalities from carbon revenues. And on the ground, we are seeing the land use shifts away from conservation, with local custodians not seeing material benefits, with erosion, biodiversity, and tree loss being the only outcomes. We have to turn the incentives for these areas around and value the standing stocks of biodiversity and carbon. These semi-protected landscapes represent a massive opportunity, and within 5 years, we would be able to access over 4 million hectares of conservation lands with just one land management partner, Conserve Global. And this landscape alone would include over 8 million tons of carbon stocks. We can scale rapidly as the biodiversity custodians like Conserve Global are able to deploy the field sensors to record the biodiversity metrics themselves, following our protocol and training. As a non-profit organization, they would then drive this revenue directly back into the landscapes they are protecting in the forms of jobs and development in the local green economies. This would increase biodiversity gains, which would increase their potential to make greater revenue with higher scoring credits being created each year. The credits are based on assessments done using camera trapping and bioacoustics, which assesses the status of the fauna and flora against a pristine area. So here you could see a greater score heading towards 100% in comparison to a pristine area would generate a greater score for both wildlife and for the plants. As a project site recovers and moves towards a pristine state, so that fauna and flora will increase. This will ultimately increase the ValueNature score, raising the market value of the credits that they create, thereby incentivizing the land custodians to invest their revenue to recover and protect their systems further. The ValueNature score is also weighted by the carbon present in the system, so shifts in this will also change the score value. So each ValueNature biodiversity token is unique and will represent 1 hectare of land for a specific project site that is protected for 1 year. The ValueNature score for each hectare is then averaged across the project site so that each token for a project site has the same score. We will use a distributed ledger process of creating proofs and validations for each piece of data created across each of the different categories, following which these data streams will be hashed on a distributed ledger technology to issue tokens, as this will mitigate the double accounting problem while also providing transparency and traceability. We have settled on the Hedera hash graph for now due to the implementation of their new Guardian network, which is working with the Interalliance's effort to standardize the tokenization of ecological credits. Token holders will be able to use our marketplace for trading of tokens until a holder decides to retire them, a process which can be done via the platform. The sale of the tokens will create a revenue which is 80% of which will be handed directly to the biodiversity custodians. We've identified 3 biodiversity custodians, 1 being the government on the top level, 2 being the community custodians, which are the heritage custodians of biodiversity and live near or in these landscapes, and 3, the land managers who are responsible for protecting these areas and often are the concession holders. We have calculated with a growth rate of just 1 million hectares of additional assessments being done after year 2, and with a token price of just $10, in other words, $10 per hectare per year, that we can create a minimum income of over $13 million for biodiversity custodians and a scaling profit margin of over $1.5 million for ValueNature by year 4. So where are we? Scientifically robust biodiversity metric and measurement standards developed? Tick. Following best practice, technology-driven, cost-effective survey methodologies? Tick. Able to verify our data on a distributed ledger technology? Partnered with a credible local wilderness custodian? Identified the first project site in Zambia of 350,000 hectares? Tick, tick, tick. The only thing outstanding is $1.5 million of investment into ValueNature. We're ready to work to become the first fully transparent and trusted biodiversity credit issuer, ensuring investments deliver exceptional biodiversity and social returns that are measurable, verifiable, and reportable. I have a minute available if there are any questions. Otherwise, I would ask that you reach out to me on my email address if you're interested.